he is absolutely a key part of the cogs, the main cogs in the Kremlin. So to have him assassinated literally in spitting distance of the Kremlin is bizarre. And we know that it is, the reverberations around Moscow at the moment are phenomenal. And on the back of Putin's failure in Syria a couple of weeks ago, I should think that the walls of the Kremlin are really shaking, and this probably has got Putin very rattled. Well, General Kurov is a very interesting character. In effect, he did the same job for Russia that I used to do for NATO in the UK, although my focus was very much on defensive, whereas Russia sees particularly chemical weapons as an offensive weapon, and we've seen them use it a lot. But Kurov first came to really knowledge and prominence in the West when he was appointed to this position. He's a 3-star general, Lieutenant General, so very, very senior, in 2017. We then had the Novichok attack in Salisbury in March 2018, where I'm talking to you from now. Now, that Novichok would have been authorized by Kirillov, would have come from we know it came from a place called Shikany, which is sort of the Russian Porton down, if you like, but it's where they made chemical weapons rather than them being destroyed as in Porton down. So he would have had his DNA all over it, and the Russian GRU agents who conducted that failed assassination of Sergei Skripal would have been trained by his forces. He then reappeared in Syria, and we've discussed before the extensive use of Syrian chemical weapons, once again to the fore with the fall of Assad and the fact that we're all now trying to make sure that Assad's chemical weapons stockpile that still remains is secured away from ISIS and jihadist hands and destroyed. But the important thing about Kirillov, along with a general called Surovkin, who people might remember was the leading Russian general in Syria and then became the boss in Ukraine, the two of them developed what I term the Russian handbook or playbook, if you like, of attacking civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, power networks. They sort of honed that in Syria and then repeated it in Ukraine. Now, part of in Syria was the use of chemical weapons by Assad. Now, it was probably not organized by Kirillov, but he would certainly know it was going on. And I understand he saw how effective chemical weapons were. So when the Russians got bogged down in the Donbass and elsewhere, well into the special military operation, it was then Kirillov who came up with the plan to use chemical weapons. And part of this story is that Ukraine indicted Kirillov yesterday for using chemical weapons over 5,000 times on the front line, predominantly a chemical called chloropicrin, which was the first chemical weapon used in the First World War, and people will now know it as a riot control agent or CS gas. It's what we call a choking agent, and it's used extensively by the Russians to great effect. In fact, the majority of their advances this year have been on the back of the use of chloropicrin chemical weapons. So he developed that there. He's also a very prominent spokesman for Putin. I mean, and this is why it's so extraordinary. This is Putin's almost his favorite general, his right-hand man. After the Salisbury poisoning, Kirillov was in social media and in Russian media saying that this was all the work of the British MI6 and other people. And recently, he's been saying that Ukraine's building a dirty bomb and intends to use that. So he is absolutely a key part of the cogs, the main cogs in the Kremlin. So to have him assassinated literally in spitting distance of the Kremlin is bizarre. And we know that it is, the reverberations around Moscow at the moment are phenomenal. And on the back of Putin's failure in Syria a couple of weeks ago, I should think that the walls of the Kremlin are really shaking, and this probably has got Putin very rattled.
Let's just talk about the circumstances of the assassination, because it is almost like something out of a Cold War spy thriller. Just talk us through what we know so far about the mechanics of this, and how it played out.
Well, as you say, this is more sort of James Bond than what we conceive to be reality at the moment. We I mean, this morning we knew very little. Certainly, when I was interviewed on Times Radio this morning, I suggested that I thought it was probably likely the Ukraine government were behind it. Now they have admitted it, that their secret service, the SBU, who we know have conducted a number of highly successful operations deep behind enemy lines, if you like, deep in Russia, seem to be behind this. It does sort of hark back to the sort of Cold War days where the old KGB were operating in the West, taking people out. The CIA and MI6 were conducting operations behind Russian lines. So this is the sort of stuff that we sort of thought was confined to the Cold War. But obviously, in a direct war between Russia and Ukraine, one would expect espionage and secret service operations to take place. The fact that the SBU have managed to, I mean, this is very complex. This sort of thing takes weeks, if not months, to plan, to get explosives into a scooter, as we understand it, and to time that explosion to go off when the general and his aide, were on it or very close by. So, in incredibly complex operation, and one assumes at the moment that these people have got away with it and fled. But within I say within spitting distance of the Kremlin, these people like Kurov would live in government apartments. They would have very tight security from the FSB and maybe the GRU as well, the Russian Secret Service. There would be what we call a ring of steel around the Kremlin, and it would be layered. So, one can imagine if you go to the Kremlin, you'll be going through, sort of gates and passes and electronic, all the rest of it. But as you move out from it, they will all have lots of surveillance devices, cameras, remote control cameras, sensors. And we understand, this is within a few miles of the Kremlin. So it should be well within that coverage. So it is extraordinary that the SBU have managed to conduct this operation that would have taken so long to put together and execute it. It would seem near perfect, and they've got away. So an extraordinary piece of espionage.
I suppose one of the inevitable questions that follows is, well, if the SBU can assassinate General Kirillov in these circumstances, could they do that to Putin?
Well, I would expect that Putin is sat in his lair at the moment, James, asking exactly the same question of himself and also his protection detail. And I expect he's extremely worried. So will some of his other generals, because he can't sort of look outside for help. If something like this happened, say in London, the British Secret Service would be working with the Americans, our European allies, and everybody else to try and make sure or create a much deeper ring. But the Russians got nobody. I mean, they can, their friends seem to be the North Koreans and the Iranians. The Iranians are absolutely hammered at the moment after their terrorist proxies have all been sort of severely downgraded in the Middle East. North Korea, I don't think anybody's terribly concerned about their secret service capabilities. So, yeah, I would have thought Putin is feeling pretty isolated at the moment. And no doubt there will be whoever's responsible for this, as in responsible for the security of Kurov and Putin. I expect they'll be heading to the Urals and the gulags there pretty rapidly, if they're still alive.
Well, the Kremlin has vowed to take revenge imminently on Ukraine. What do you think that revenge may look like?
Well, if the Kremlin had not said this, one would be very surprised. Of course, they're going to say it. It's difficult to see. I mean, they will fire more missiles, no doubt, at schools and hospitals. All the pathetic targets that Russia aims at. They will no doubt throw more North Koreans into the meat grinder of Kursk. But apart from that, I'm struggling to see they might well try and themselves to assassinate Ukrainian generals in Kyiv or elsewhere. But it's fairly common knowledge they tried certainly in the early days to get Zelensky, but there rather better protection around Zelensky, I would have thought, than Putin. So yeah, one expects them to do something, but anything better than they've done in the last sort of 1,000+ days, I would be surprised.
And of course, it's brought into sharp relief again Russia's use of chemical weapons as part of its war in Ukraine. What do you think the wider world and Ukraine's allies should be doing to help Ukraine, who are facing that chemical weapons threat?
Well, that's a very good question, James. And really, I think, first of all, this is a big wake-up call for the UK and NATO. We look at what we call CBRN defense, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear defense. The Russians look at it as offense. They look at it as an offensive weapon. And I think we've really forgotten that in the West, really since the Cold War. So number one, we need to realize that if we do have to confront the Russians, then chemical weapons are definitely going to be part of it. And we need to up our game. And when it comes to Ukraine, the thing that I find devastatingly frustrating is the fact that if the Russians are using chloropicrin, which is just a riot control agent, there's a very simple way to make it ineffective by making sure that the Russian soldiers have respirators, gas masks, if you like. And unfortunately, at the moment, they have very few. And the ones that they do have are old Russian ones. And it's probably counterintuitive to the molecule in chloropicrin is quite a complex molecule. You need a really good filter on your gas mask to filter it out. And the Russian ones don't do it. So what they need is really good sort of gas masks. And Britain is the biggest and best producer of gas masks in the world. So it's not beyond the wit that we could help them out. And certainly, with others, we are trying to sort of crowdfund and get as many as we can to the front line. So there is an easy solution there. But it is, there's a solution and problem that Ukraine has, but there's a wider issue for NATO and the UK that we need to recognise absolutely that this is a threat we need to mitigate, as Russia is still the adversary that we are most likely to have to fight in the next few years.